If we look at some of the NDR interventions still to come, and these are even more serious than the ones we've had already, there's the Expropriation Bill of 2020, very much the same as the 2015 one that wasn't taken forward, but with the key difference now that you can get no compensation in many instances, and as before, inadequate compensation in almost every other case. Compensation will often be less than the amount of mortgage debt which is outstanding, and that raises all sorts of other questions, because though the mortgage itself will come to an end when the state takes ownership so that the bank can't foreclose on the property now owned by the government, the underlying debt doesn't come to an end, and the expropriated owner is still expected to pay it. But having lost a key asset, he or she may not be able to do so. So there's a real risk of defaults and of property values going down, and perhaps even of a banking crisis, as the Banking Association of South Africa has tried repeatedly to warn the government. There's also a possibility that once we have the expropriation bill in place, we'll see other legislation being introduced, which will give the state custodianship, say, of agricultural land or of certain land. The 2014 bill that I refer to there did propose to give the state custodianship of all agricultural land. In the end, that bill didn't proceed, but it could be revived and brought back in the future. The 2021 Constitutional Amendment Bill, people may recall, proposed to give the state custodianship of certain land. What certain land means is, of course, highly uncertain, but it's certainly possible that it could include, say, all privately owned land. We simply don't know. And there would be no compensation payable on the taking of custodianship of land, which of course is what happened in 1998 when water resources were vested in the custodianship of the state. The same thing happened in 2004 when mineral resources beneath the ground were vested in the custodianship of the state. And the ANC was very pleased when in 2013 the Constitutional Court in the Agri-SA case said that this was all fine. You didn't have to pay compensation because the taking of custodianship was effectively a deprivation, not an expropriation, and there is a right to compensation only when you're dealing with an expropriation. The case, fortunately, is very badly argued. It's very weak. I think it can be contested. I think it's an example of how the Constitution's meaning has quietly been changed, but the words are still the same, and one hopes one can rely on them. And then what we also have coming is what I think the first one we're still quite well aware of. Let me just go back, which is the NHI. The NHI bill has already gone through the National Assembly. It's before the National Council of Provinces. It will put an end to all medical schemes. It will create a single state-run medical aid, the NHI fund, which even COSATU at times sounds worried about. It will give the state control of all health services, the fees to be paid, the medicines to be provided, the treatments to be made available, and it will lead to the state rationing health services. There won't be enough, so the state effectively will decide what illnesses, in what circumstances, are to be treated. Then we have what people are much less aware of, a similar proposal coming up through in terms of the National Social Security Fund. This is still just at the green paper stage, and the last time it was published by the minister, it was withdrawn in the face of a general outcry. But it's absolutely crucial to the ANC, and so I think it's likely to come back. And it would result in a single, probably state-run pension system, with private pension schemes no longer being allowed to operate, like medical schemes will not be allowed to. State control of all pension savings, which currently amount to more than 6 trillion, and all pension contributions as they are made in the future. And again, a state rationing of pension payouts. There won't be enough. The emphasis will be on equality, and the ANC thinks it more important that the money that will be in that fund should first be used to pay disability and survivor benefits, where people die at work, then and they don't have life insurance. It's this fund that will provide the money to their dependents. So there will be much less available for pensions than perhaps people think. So then there's also the basic income grant, which is to be funded probably by a wealth tax, though we don't know. A basic income grant would probably be introduced at the lower food poverty level. According to the Centre for Development and Enterprise, it would cost 280 billion a year at the start. If it's taken up to the upper food poverty level, it would cost 600 billion a year. And again, that's money that we simply don't have in the kitty and we can't easily afford to borrow. So the idea is that it might be funded by a wealth tax. And this is a tax which is levied on the ownership of all assets, from homes probably to pension savings and various other things. Very few countries levy a wealth tax because they are difficult to administer and they tend to yield rather little. But the government has great hopes that our wealth tax will yield a great deal and will also help to reduce inequality. Then the South African Reserve Bank and the National Treasury are to be brought into line. The SACP in particular is almost apoplectic against them at the moment because they are in thrall to neoliberalism and austerity. The austerity is difficult to see given the way public spending has been going on. The neoliberalism is also, again, a little difficult to see against the face of the NDR and all its interventions. But for Saab, the idea seems to be that instead of hiking interest rates, they should rather do things like, well, rather the government as a whole, because the Saab can't do that, like increasing taxes and also imposing price controls. For the Treasury, it's constantly being told that it must stop talking about the need to, sort of weigh one need against another, that all needs can be met, particularly if you print money in the way that modern monetary theorists think you can. And so it shouldn't be standing in the way of the NHI or the basic income grant, or the idea of public employment for all, or the idea of the state pension system. And overall, particularly in relation to the big, there's increasingly now also an undercurrent message that if we don't get a basic income grant soon, then we can expect a rerun of the dreadful July 2021 riots. Public spending and public debt have in fact been rising very rapidly since 2009. Our ratio of public debt to GDP already exceeds 70% and looks set to go up higher quite fast because we're simply not bringing down public spending as fast as we should be. But all of this is in line with the Cloward-Piven strategy, if I pronounce that correctly. This was developed in the United States in the 1960s by two left-leaning academics at Columbia University in New York, who said what you need to do is burden the state with a whole number of incredibly costly, in fact impossible to meet burdens, because in the end you will bankrupt the state. And that will help to cripple the capitalist economy, create such a crisis that you can then push for your socialist alternative.
Apropos the NHI, I've read that the NHI is going to attempt to access the money that we, who are members of medical aids, voluntarily contribute every month to these medical aids. How do they intend to do this?
They intend to do it via taxation. So at the moment, just to take a round figure, if individuals are contributing, say, 250 billion rand a month to their medical aids for the private healthcare of their choice, they will instead find themselves facing tax increases of a similar magnitude. And this can be done through surcharges on personal income tax, the ANC has said, or perhaps by introducing a kind of poll tax. There's been some talk of that, but I think they would try to avoid that because that would cause a lot of resistance at the grassroots level. But what is also very serious, and I think people don't realize, is that they'll be told these are NHI taxes. This money is going to go into the NHI fund, and then it'll be available for you and for everyone for healthcare needs. But actually, under the Constitution, all revenue has to be paid into the General Revenue Fund and used for all general purposes, including public service wages and SOE bailouts, unless the National Treasury agrees that there should be specific legislation which will earmark revenue raised through these taxes specifically for the NHI fund. In the absence of that legislation, which the Treasury is very reluctant to push for or see adopted, the money that is raised through taxes will go into the general fund And at the end of the day, it will unfortunately, one of the consequences will be to help grease the ANC patronage machine rather than be kept available for health. And there is experience of that in Canada, where the Fraser Institute, which is a think tank there, has tried to analyze how much of the so-called health taxes are actually used for a healthcare system that's similar to the NHI. It's a single-payer system. And they've come to the conclusion that a lot of it gets lost along the way and swept into other state needs.